One of Bon Scott's earlier bands, Fang, had toured with one of Brian Johnson's earlier bands. During a tour of the UK in 1973, Fang opened a series of shows for a band called Geordie. At the time, Geordie's lead singer was Brian Johnson. In an interview from 2011, Brian Johnson recalls that Bon Scott was very impressed by his stage antics during one show, even though they weren't actually stage antics. Here's the quote. "I had a terrible case of appendicitis and I went down on my side, kicking and going, oh, but I kept on singing. Apparently, Bon later told the boys, I saw this guy Brian Johnson sing, and he was great. He was on the floor, kicking and screaming, what an act. Of course, it wasn't an act. I was really ill." End quote. One of the most iconic parts of AC/DC's live shows is when Angus Young gets on the lead singer's shoulders. He's done that with both Bon Scott and Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson used to do that when he was in Geordie, and according to various sources, Bon Scott got the idea to lift Angus Young up on his shoulders after seeing Brian Johnson do that with Geordie's lead guitarist Vic Malcolm. I think it's cool that Bon Scott and Brian Johnson had that mutual respect for each other. Angus Young recalls the following about Brian Johnson. Quote, "I remember the first time I had ever heard Brian Johnson's name was from Bon. Bon had mentioned that he had been in England once touring with a band, and he had mentioned that Brian had been in a band called Geordie, and Bon had said, Brian Johnson. He was a great rock and roll singer in the style of Little Richard. And that was Bon's big idol, Little Richard. I think when he saw Brian at the time, to Bon it was, well, here's a guy that knows what rock and roll is all about. He mentioned that to us in Australia. I suppose when we decided to continue, Brian was the first name that Malcolm and myself came up with, so we said we should see if we could find him." End quote. Brian Johnson would eventually be selected as the new singer of the band, and one of the reasons he was chosen was because of the respect he had for Bon Scott. According to Malcolm Young, when they met Brian Johnson, he had, quote, tears in his eyes. He was as sad about Bon as we were.